Reformed thinking. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are getting into one of the most intellectually rigorous and I think theologically necessary questions in Christian thought.
It's a big one.
A big one, yeah. The structure of original sin. We're going back to the source, really, to the arguments of Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century.
And specifically, his defense of what he calls native depravity against a pretty sharp challenger from his time, a man we just know as Dr. T.
Right. And this isn't just, a dusty historical debate. For anyone trying to really understand the architecture of Reformed thought on human nature, this is central stuff.
It really is. It gets to the very core of how total corruption can be native to us from birth.
Exactly. So our mission, for you listening, is to grasp how Edwards pulls this off. How does he account for total corruption, this native depravity, without stumbling into the trap that Dr. T so carefully laid for him?
Which is the charge that you're making God, the holy creator, the direct, active cause of evil in the human soul.
And that's a theological line you just can't cross. It's the tightrope walk.
It is. I mean, the puzzle is right there in front of you. If God forms every single one of us, and every one of us shows up in the world with a nature that is already bent against him, a sinful nature.
Well, the question writes itself, doesn't it? Did God create that corruption?
Dr. T certainly thought so. He basically said, look, if you believe in a sinful nature from birth, you're charging God, the author of our nature, with being the direct source of that sin.
And Edwards knew he had to dismantle that argument from the ground up. He had to show that the source of corruption is structural, not substantial.
Okay, that's a key distinction right there. He had to correct a really fundamental mistake in Dr. T's thinking.
Yes. The assumption that corruption has to be a positive influence.
Like what? Like a stain or...
Or a chemical, an injection of poison, something God would have to actively, put there.
But Edwards says no, that's not it at all. He argues that sin is defined, first and foremost, by an absence, a privation.
And that single distinction, is it a positive addition or is it a consequential absence?
Yeah.
That is the entire battlefield. If you miss that point, the whole doctrine kind of falls apart under Dr. T's accusation against God's character.
It does.
Okay, so let's unpack this defense. Let's start with the grand objection itself, the thing that forced Edwards to lay all this out.
Let's set the stage.
So the premise of Dr. T's argument, he says that believing men are born with a sinful nature is, and this is his phrase, highly injurious to the character of God. This isn't just an academic disagreement for him.
Oh, no, it's a moral attack on God's nature. He frames it with, a lot of rhetorical power. He asks how the person who formed us in the womb can be making something that is, at the same time, hateful to him.
It's a powerful image.
It is. He's saying, look, if God makes the creature, and that creature's very nature is sinful from the get-go, then you can't get around calling God the author of that sin. For him, creation is a positive act. So the result must be God's direct work.
It's a logical trap, isn't it? If you assume that every quality of a thing is positively put there by its maker.
Right.
And sin is a quality.
Right. Then the maker put the sin there. Dr. T felt he had the doctrine completely cornered. He wasn't just talking about, human weakness. He was defending divine holiness as he saw it.
And this leads us straight to that core assumption you mentioned, the idea of a positive infusion.
Right. Edwards saw that this was the linchpin of the whole argument. Dr. T just takes it for granted that depravity has to be a positive quality, something the creator has to actively introduce.
And the sources show he used some very specific, almost medical language.
He did. Words like a taint, a tincture, or an infection. He pictures it as something that has to be actively infused or wrought into the mind.
That language is so important. Taint, tincture, infection.
Yeah.
It makes corruption sound like a material substance.
Exactly, like a chemical additive. It suggests depravity needs its own separate, active, positive cause to exist.
And if you grant him that premise, his conclusion is, well, it's pretty much unavoidable.
It is. If sin is this positive thing that gets implanted, then the creator, the one forming the person, must be the one implanting these evil dispositions right there in the womb.
And for Dr. T, that's just a non-starter. It's completely incompatible with a holy and just God. He can't accept a God who actively installs moral malware in us at birth.
He finds it unthinkable.
Okay, but hang on. Before we get to Edwards' solution, let me just play Dr. T's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
Let's say Edwards is right, and sin is just the absence of something good, the absence of spiritual influence. Doesn't God still have to bear the responsibility for that?
How so?
Because God is the one who chose to withhold that influence. It's sort of like saying, oh, I didn't cause the house fire. I just decided not to give the building any water after I knew it was absolutely necessary to prevent a disaster.
Ah, I see.
Isn't that knowing withdrawal of a necessary grace still in some sense an authoring act?
That is the highest level of the challenge, and Edwards knew he had to meet it head on. His answer has to separate the author of our nature, which is God, from the cause of our sin.
Which he says is.
Man's own nature, reacting to that privation. Edwards argues there is, and I'm quoting here, not the least need of supposing any evil quality infused, implanted, or wrought into the nature of man by any positive cause at all.
So he completely changes the terms of the debate.
He does. He says God is responsible for the created structure, but man is responsible for the sin that comes from that structure failing.
Okay, so he's not saying it's a positive infusion of evil. He's saying it's the result of a just penal consequence.
Yes. The withholding of a special divine influence. To defend that, he has to give us a complete anatomy of the human soul as it was originally designed.
He doesn't try to downplay depravity at all.
Not at all. He just gives it a new, and I would say a more accurate architecture.
All right, let's get into that. Edwards' anatomy of the soul. He solves this whole problem by first showing us the perfect design. He says God put two very different kinds of principles in man at creation.
Right, and they weren't meant to compete. They were designed for perfect harmony, a perfect hierarchy.
You have the natural and the supernatural.
Exactly. The principles you need just to exist as a human and the principles you need for holiness.
So let's start at the bottom with the inferior or natural principles. Edwards calls these the servant principles.
These are the basic building blocks of mere human nature. They define us as self-aware, active beings.
So things like self-love, natural appetites.
Yes, and passions. They are what drive a person to seek their own liberty, honor, and pleasure. Edwards is very clear. These things are inseparable from what it means to be human. They aren't evil in themselves. They're like the basic operating system.
You couldn't be human without them.
You couldn't. If you took them away, you wouldn't have human nature anymore.
And there's a specific biblical term for these drives when they get out of control.
Right. Edwards points out that when these principles are left alone and left to themselves, Scripture calls them the flesh.
Which is so helpful because it clarifies that flesh isn't just about our physical bodies. It's about this whole complex of natural desires when they're in charge.
Precisely. And in Eden, their intended role was to be in strict subordination. They were given only to serve.
The engine, but not the driver.
That's a perfect way to put it. And they always remain no matter what a person's spiritual state is. Even after the fall, even in a regenerate person, human nature would be human nature still. But their proper place is on the bottom rung.
Okay, so if the inferior principles are the engine and the chassis of the car, we still need a driver and maybe a GPS.
Yes. And that brings us to the superior or supernatural principles. This is what Edwards calls the governor.
And these are from a completely different category.
A different order entirely. They reflect the spiritual image of God. They are the spiritual, holy, and divine principles.
And he summarizes them all as basically being contained in one thing.
Divine love. That's the essence of it. This is the capacity for true holiness, true righteousness. It's the part of humanity that was designed to be in communion with God and reflect his nature.
We hear scriptural terms for this, like the spirit or the divine nature.
Right. But the critical point Edwards makes is about their source. He calls them supernatural for a reason.
They don't just spring up from our own human existence like self-preservation does.
No. They depend entirely on man's union and communion with God. They are maintained by the constant communications and influences of God's Spirit. They are a gift and a connection that has to be actively maintained.
That dependency is everything to his argument.
It's the whole key. These principles were the governor put there by God to possess the throne in the heart and maintain absolute dominion. Their whole job was to keep the natural principles, self-love, appetites, wholly subordinate and subservient to God's law and glory.
So when it's all working as designed, you have a perfect creature. The engine of self-love is running, but it's being directed by the divine driver, which is divine love.
Yes. Edwards describes that original state as one where all was in excellent order, peace, and beautiful harmony. It's a structure of righteousness.
And having that clear structure is what makes his whole defense work. Because now, when we look at the fall, we're not looking for something evil that God added.
We're looking for something good that God, as a just judge, removed.
Let's move to that then, the mechanism of corruption. Privation, not infusion. It all starts with the event of the fall. Adam sinned. He incurred God's curse. What was the immediate structural consequence for his soul?
The immediate consequence was the withdrawal of the governor. This is the core of Edward's argument. The corruption that followed comes from privation, the simple and justified withholding of a special divine influence.
Why was it justified?
Because, in Edwards's view, it was utterly improper and inconsistent with the constitution God had established for a holy God to keep maintaining that intimate communion, the very source of those superior principles, with a creature in open rebellion.
So it wasn't that the spiritual image of God just, fizzled out on its own. The power cord was pulled. God left Adam.
That's it exactly. The moment God withdrew that vital connection, that flow of the Spirit that sustains spiritual life, the superior divine principles wholly ceased. They just vanished.
Why?
Because their source had been cut off. That's the great moment of structural ruin. The governor is gone.
And this is where he brings in that unforgettable illustration, the candle analogy.
Yes, it's so effective because it perfectly illustrates the nature of privation. He says the end of these superior principles is just like light ceasing in a room when you take the candle out.
The person who took the candle away didn't have to pump a substance called darkness into the room.
Of course not. Darkness is just the inevitable, necessary result of the absence of light. Darkness isn't a positive creation. It's just a consequence of the light no longer being there.
I think this is a point we have to really emphasize, because it can be hard for us to think about sin this way.
How do you mean?
Well, when we see a really wicked act, like a murder or some malicious act of pride, it feels like a very positive thing. It feels like a massive addition of evil substance into the world.
Right. It's an action. It's a presence.
But Edwards is saying that even that positive wicked act is just the outward expression of a deeper absence.
Precisely. The act itself is positive, yes, but its metaphysical root is negative. It comes from the absence of that regulating divine principle. God didn't have to create some new positive evil in Adam's heart.
He just withdrew the divine light.
And man was instantly left in a state of spiritual darkness. The result was woeful corruption and ruin, nothing but flesh without spirit.
There's a difference between saying a machine was poisoned
A causative infusion.
and saying the machine's operating system crashed. Now, the raw hardware drivers are just running wild and chaotically.
A privation followed by consequential disorder. Yes.
So what does that structural ruin actually look like? What happens in that instant when the governor of divine love is gone?
The inferior principles, self-love, and the natural appetites, they are suddenly left alone and left to themselves.
And since they're designed for action, for self-preservation, they don't just sit there quietly.
Not for a second. They immediately become the absolute masters of the heart because there is no spiritual authority, no counterweight left to keep them in their subordinate role.
It sounds like pure chaos.
And
it wasn't a slow decline.
No, it was immediate. Edwards calls it a fatal catastrophe, a turning of all things upside down. The result is an odious and dreadful confusion.
So these natural principles, they're meant to pursue self-interest. But in the original design, that was all contained within the greater goal of God's glory.
Right. But now, with that divine constraint gone, the engine is running without brakes, without steering, without a map. It's just pursuing its own immediate ends as if they were the supreme good.
Okay, so let's look really closely at the consequences of that failure, the reign of the flesh. Because this is the moment total depravity really takes hold.
Yes. The natural drives, which were once good servants, become inherently destructive the moment they start to rule.
And to help us visualize that danger, Edwards gives us another really powerful metaphor, the fire analogy.
He does. He says these uncontrolled inferior principles are like fire in a house.
Fire is a good servant, but a bad master.
Exactly. It's very useful when it's kept in its place, in the hearth. But if you let it take over the whole house, it brings everything to destruction.
Self-love is necessary to live, but when it becomes the supreme principle, it just consumes everything. Our relationship with God, our relationships with other people.
And that gets to a critical philosophical point. Self-love, when it's properly ordered, is love for the self under God. But when disorder reigns, it becomes love for the self as God.
And that leads directly to what Edwards calls the inversion of allegiance.
When self-love becomes the supreme thing, man immediately sets up himself and the objects of his private affections and appetites as supreme.
That's it. That's the fundamental definition of sin, isn't it? Taking God's place on the throne of your own heart.
And it's why every human heart is by nature corrupt. Man is now, by default, pursuing his own honor, his own pleasure, his own liberty, without regard to God's honor or law.
Self-glorification automatically replaces God glorification as the mainspring of the soul.
It becomes the new operating principle.
But Edwards takes it a step further. He doesn't just say this leads to chaos. He says this structural failure results in active enmity against God.
Hmm.
Why? Why is mere self-love necessarily active hostility? Can't a self-centered person just be indifferent to God, just ignore him?
No, and the reason is because God doesn't permit indifference. God still exists, and he still requires supreme allegiance and absolute dominion over that person's heart.
He doesn't change his demands just because we've changed.
Not at all. So the human heart, which is now run entirely by self-love and private interest, finds the demands of the true king demands, which require the submission of that private interest, to be completely repulsive.
No, conflict is absolutely guaranteed. If the supreme master of my heart is my pleasure, and God's law demands that his pleasure be supreme,
Then your very nature, your very structure, is in direct, constant, and active opposition to his lawful rule.
that's what he means by the state of war.
Yes. The immediate consequence of the superior principles being gone is enmity in the heart. The will refuses to acknowledge God's supreme authority. And from that one root, this private, self-centered, original, every specific lust and every depraved disposition naturally grows.
So you can trace the whole chain of logic, the privation, the withdrawal of the spirit,
Leads to structural ruin. Self-love seizes the throne.
which necessarily leads to active corruption, the war against God.
It's a brilliant summary of corruption. Edwards has now accounted for the total corruption of the heart, the fact that every part of us is disordered, without ever needing God to put any positive evil into us.
It's a system failure, and that failure is followed by a necessary revolt of the subordinate parts.
Precisely.
Okay, so that seems to solve Dr. T's main objection
Yeah.
about God's holiness. But we're not quite done, because Dr. T would still have a follow-up question. He'd say, fine, Adam ruined himself. I'll grant you that. But how does this state of absence, this privation, get passed down to every single generation after him?
Right. Why is the entire human race born without the governor if God is actively forming each new soul from nothing?
This is the transmission problem. And it pushes us into, well, some pretty deep theological waters.
It does. It gets into the principles of creation itself. Dr. T's point would be, if God creates the soul of an infant, and that soul is missing this necessary spiritual principle, then God is the one doing the withholding.
And therefore, God is the one creating the corrupt state. He's back to his original charge.
So Edwards has to address this, and he does it by carefully defining what he means by the course of nature.
It's a term he has to be very precise about.
Extremely. He defines the course of nature not as some independent self-running machine, but as nothing but the established order of the agency and operation of the author of nature.
In other words, it's just God's settled, consistent way of doing things.
It's his method. The key word is consistency. God operates according to the rules and systems that he himself established at the beginning.
And one of those fundamental rules is the relationship between Adam and all of his descendants.
A relationship that Reformed theology calls federal headship, or the covenant of works. Edwards uses a natural analogy to illustrate it. He calls it the root and branch connection.
Okay, what does that mean?
He says that Adam's posterity, that's all of us, we are derived from him according to an established course of nature, just like branches come from an oak tree or an acorn comes from an oak.
So there's a natural organic connection.
Yes, and it illustrates a fixed law of nature. The good qualities wanting in the tree should also be wanting in the branches. If the root is sick, the branches will be sick.
But hold on, we have to be careful there. The analogy only goes so far, doesn't it? The physical body might descend naturally like that, but Christian theology holds that God creates the soul new for every single infant.
That's the critical difficulty, you're right. How does the absence of a spiritual quality, like divine love, get transmitted through a natural law when the spiritual part of the child is a fresh creation?
It seems like a contradiction.
It's not, but to solve it, you have to link that natural law of propagation to the legal reality of the covenant. Adam didn't just lose that spiritual principle for himself personally. He lost it as the federal head of the entire human race. He was our representative.
So when he fell, the whole race he represented fell with him, legally speaking.
Yes. Therefore, when God continues to create souls according to his established order, the course of nature, he acts in a way that is consistent with the prior judicial sentence that was passed on the race's representative.
This is where we get to the idea of withholding as divine justice.
Exactly. Since Adam, the root and the head, lost that vital spiritual influence as a penal consequence for his rebellion.
It was a punishment.
It was a just punishment. And so God acts consistently and justly by withholding those same influences from all the members of that fallen race. Every infant comes into existence as part of a fallen federal structure.
And so they come into the world without that supernatural maintenance system already in place.
The result is they come into existence as mere flesh. They are entirely under the government of their own inferior principles because they lack the necessary governor from the start.
So they aren't born actively hating God yet, but their internal structure is set up in such a way that hostility toward God is their only possible moral trajectory.
That's it. No positive evil needs to be implanted by God. The corruption is the necessary, consistent, and just result of the absence of the spiritual governor. God is simply treating the branches according to the established state of the root. He's upholding the terms of his own covenant.
And this allows Edwards to finally land the plane and achieve his main goal, reconciling God's authorship.
He can say with perfect consistency that God is the author of our being. He creates the soul. He creates the necessary natural principles like self-love and the passions.
But he is not the author of the sin.
The sin is the disorder and the enmity that results when those natural principles are left to themselves, which they inevitably are, because the spiritual governor was justly withdrawn from the race in Adam.
God is responsible for the design of the house. Man is responsible for the fire that burns it down when the safety systems are removed.
A good way to put it.
Edwards uses one final analogy to really nail this distinction down, comparing it to a wicked adult.
He does. He says, imagine God permits a wicked adult man to continue in his wickedness by withholding further grace. Maybe God doesn't send a preacher to him or doesn't move on his heart to bring repentance.
In that case, we wouldn't say God is the author of that man's ongoing sin, would we?
No, of course not. The man's sin is caused by his own corrupt nature, his own unchecked self-love. God's role is permissive and judicial, not causative.
And Edwards says the same principle applies to the infinite birth. God is not the author of sin when he allows a child to be born without that supernatural grace that was forfeited by the head of the human race.
His argument against Dr. T holds firm. To withhold the influence without which nature will become corrupt is an act of divine justice. It is not the creation of evil.
The corruption is the work of our unchecked self-love, and God's role in it is that of a righteous judge, upholding the constitutional integrity of his created order.
It's a masterful defense.
It really is.
Yeah.
This has been a structurally precise and I think really necessary deep dive. So to kind of synthesize the key takeaway for you, the listener, it's this. Depravity, for Edwards, is a catastrophic structural failure. It's a state of confusion and self-idolatry that results from the absence of the spiritual governor, which is divine love, not from the addition of some evil substance.
And that distinction, privation versus positive infusion, is what lets us affirm the full biblical scope of total depravity.
The fact that our entire being is disordered and opposed to God.
While at the same time maintaining God's perfect holiness and justice in creation, it means the spiritual life isn't about just fixing a small flaw in an otherwise good system.
No, it's about restoring the lost presence of God's Spirit to regain that proper order. It's about re-enthroning divine love in the heart.
That structural insight just changes how you see everything. We recognize that those natural principles, self-love, the desire for liberty, for honor, for pleasure, they are necessary parts of us.
They don't vanish when a person is regenerated. The fire doesn't leave the house.
It's just put back in the hearth. It's placed back under proper governance.
Which raises one final and a pretty provocative question for you to think about as you reflect on all this and apply it to your own life.
Since those natural principles do remain, even in the regenerate soul, how do we distinguish moment by moment between the right use of those natural desires when they're serving God and the sinful dominion of the flesh, where self-love is trying to seize the throne all over again in our own hearts today?
Something to wrestle with as you pursue that spiritual order. Thank you for diving deep with us.
Until next time.